de la empresa de Kencom. Algunos trainers que les hablo. Bien, la charla del día de hoy que nos va a dar que nos va a dar Dave va a ser acerca del futuro de Scrum de aquí hacia 20 años. Va a hablar acerca del repaso de Scrum, que por qué ha sido tan exitoso estos años, y luego el futuro de Scrum de aquí hacia 20 años. La charla va a ser en inglés. Dave no habla español. Si alguno de ustedes, Dave va a hablar despacio. Si alguno de ustedes tiene alguna duda, algún comentario, una pregunta, yo le pido que interrumpa en cualquier momento para poder aclarar. Si desean, puedo hacer traducción simultánea en algunas partes o vamos todo en inglés. No sé cuál es qué es lo que es, dónde se siente más cómodo. Ya está, ¿no? Hello, Dave.
Hi, this is Dave.
Hello, Dave. Can you hear me?
It is working.
Hello, Dave. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay.
my son's just asking me. But yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're going to start in 10 minutes.
10 minutes, yeah? Okay, so let me just get the screen up and everything. Just give me a minute.
Yeah, okay. This is fine.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Good.
Bien, para ir explicándoles un poco, Scrum.org es la organización que mantiene la guía de Scrum. La guía de Scrum es el marco de referencia, el documento donde se encuentra definido cuáles son las reglas de Scrum. Hay una guía en español, esa guía en español ha sido traducido por Lucho, un amigo de Colombia, un amigo de España, y también participó en la traducción de la guía.
Okay.
Dave arregla un poco la conexión. Bueno, Dave va a hablar acerca de Scrum.org, pero yo les voy mencionando algunos puntos importantes. En el mercado existen varias organizaciones que están integrando en Scrum. Tenemos a Scrum Alliance y otras organizaciones. Scrum.org se diferencia en varias cosas y es probablemente la institución más importante, y ahora vamos a mencionar por qué, ¿no? La guía de Scrum es la única guía que representa el marco de referencia Scrum. Esta guía es actualizada por Ken Schreiber y Jeff Sutherland, que son los creadores de Scrum. Ustedes entran a la página de Scrum.org y lo van a poder ver. Herramientas para practitioners para poder aplicar Scrum, assessments, autoevaluaciones. También ustedes pueden entrar a la página de Scrum.org y van a encontrar allí evaluaciones en línea para que puedan practicar. Hay foros, también pueden encontrar foros, material. Por ejemplo, si yo estoy implementando Scrum y tengo una duda acerca de Scrum, por ejemplo, no me funciona el Daily Scrum, o de repente no sé si la retrospectiva está correctamente aplicada, yo puedo escribir al foro y los trainers van a responderles. Escriben a support.scrum.org y le van a responder. O sea, hay una conexión directa con quienes están usando Scrum. Scrum.org no solamente brinda internet, sino también brinda soporte. Para ese soporte y para esas consultas ustedes no tienen que pagar. Está libre, ahí está, ¿no? Por la inscripción y entrenamiento a todo nivel. Ahí está. El creador de Scrum es Ken Schreiber. Un nombre complicado de pronunciar. Es uno de los que ha firmado el manifiesto ágil. En Bolivia hicimos un evento que se llamó el Scrum Day for Professionals, y en Bolivia Ken Schreiber aperturó el evento. Ahí está, donde he escrito libros. Uno de los libros que yo les recomiendo que lean es Software en 30 días, Software in 30 Days. Es el libro que les recomiendo que lean. Ahí cuenta historias de proyectos para el Ministerio de Defensa de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Enormes, de miles de varios millones de dólares, que empezaron haciéndose en cascada y que luego, al usar Scrum, estos proyectos recién entraron en una madurez y empezaron a producir resultados, ¿no? Si alguien alguna vez ha escuchado hablar de Scrum como un marco ágil para proyectos pequeños, yo les sugiero que lean ese libro. Y ese libro cuenta casos reales en los cuales Kate Schwaber ha participado como consultor aplicando Scrum. Además, en este libro se menciona algo muy importante, que es algo así como la ruta de adopción de Scrum y las fases de madurez para adoptar Scrum. Las fases empiezan en 1 hasta llegar a una fase que se llama Software Factory, en la cual toda la empresa usa el enfoque ágil. Les recomiendo que lean el libro, que se lo compren. La misión de Scrum, tenemos un eslogan nosotros que se llama To Improve the Profession of Software Development. Ese es el resumen de todo. ¿Cuál es el objetivo de Scrum? Adelante, por favor. El objetivo de Scrum es mejorar la profesión de desarrollo de software. O sea, la misión, este eslogan involucra muchas cosas, ¿no? Porque no es solo entrenar, no es solamente aplicar Scrum, no es solamente usar el marco de referencia, sino es mejorar el desarrollo del software en sí. Y eso implica muchas cosas, ¿no? Bueno, hablando de los trainers, nosotros mencionamos que Scrum.org posee los mejores trainers del planeta. Hace un par de semanas hablaba con alguien de Chile, una consultora que me preguntaba cómo ser trainer. Y le explicaba el proceso para ser trainer. Primero, el proceso para ser trainer es llevar los cursos. Son varios cursos que tienen que llevar. Este es mi perfil de Scrum.org. Y aquí en mi perfil ustedes pueden ver todas las certificaciones de Scrum.org. Entonces, cuando me hablaba acerca de cómo ser trainer, en realidad es una ruta bastante larga, ¿no? Y finaliza con una reunión de varios trainers, los trainers, evaluando al candidato trainer. Hace 2 días tuvimos una reunión justamente con un trainer que trabaja en una consultora mundial muy grande, que tiene, a mi consideración, mucha experiencia, pero faltaba algo para que sea trainer todavía, ¿no? Hay cosas que todavía no. Entonces, el proceso para ser trainer es bastante grande, ¿no? Y una vez que se es trainer, para mantener el marco de trabajo y el marco de referencia unificado, los trainers tienen que reunirse todos los años con el creador de Scrum y el grupo que mantiene la guía de Scrum, ¿no? Trainers de Europa, de América, de todas partes del mundo, ¿no? Para unificar el modelo y que no suceda lo que a veces pasa, ¿no? Bueno, yo te entreno vía Skype, remotamente, y entonces tú entiendes de alguna manera Scrum y entregas el marco de trabajo a tu entender, y eso va distorsionando las cosas. Por ejemplo, una de las cosas que sucede en Scrum es que no hay gestión de proyectos. Al no haber gestión de proyectos, implica una transformación de quienes hacen gestión de proyectos para que se vuelvan gestores de producto y entiendan el producto para poder interactuar con el equipo, ¿no? A veces podemos hablar de gestión de proyectos con Scrum. En Scrum no hay gestión de proyectos, lo que hay es gestión de producto. Eso implica una transformación del rol del gestor para que se convierta en una especie de product owner y de esa manera pueda gestionar el producto y pueda interactuar con el equipo. Bueno, la currícula estandarizada. El curso inicial con el cual se inicia se llama Professional Scrum Foundation. Y luego vienen todos los demás cursos, ¿no? Professional Scrum Master, Professional Scrum Product Owner, Professional Scrum Developer. ¿Qué es lo que pasa, no? En el mercado se escucha mucho la certificación Scrum Master. En realidad, para ser Scrum Master hay que tener algunos atributos como el tema de mentoring, coaching, ¿no? Teaching, capacidad de enseñanza, y eso se consigue con tiempo y con experiencia y con proyectos. Para ser Scrum Master lleva mucho. El Professional Scrum Foundation es el primer curso que da la certificación Professional Scrum Master 1. la certificación Production Scrum Master 2. Es el siguiente curso, es el siguiente paso. Aquí está, el curso que nosotros vamos a brindar la próxima semana tiene el marco de trabajo de Scrum, el enfoque ágil, la planificación, cómo mantener Scrum saludable, quiere decir cuáles son algunos aspectos que deberíamos considerar para poder usar Scrum, ¿no? Algunos antipatrones de Scrum. El curso de Product Owner para quienes sigan la línea de Product Owners. Y el curso de Product Development, nosotros planeamos darlo después, que puede ser para .NET Java, para que los equipos de desarrollo aprendan a trabajar como equipo usando herramientas de ingeniería de software, como puede ser Team Foundation, control de versiones, gestión del cambio, de la configuración, gestión del despliegue, ¿no? Bueno, vamos a conectarnos con Dave. Ya estamos. Dave.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we are ready.
You're ready?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Hopefully can you see me as well?
Yeah, I will show you our audience.
That would be good to see who I'm talking to.
Yeah.
Otherwise it could be just Joel, and you know, this is all a pretend, just so you can hear me talk, Joel. So it'd be good to see if you can just share for a second if you have a webcam.
Yeah. Can you see?
No. Let me just make sure. Oh, there's me. You can see me. No, I don't need to see me. I know what I look like. Oh, I can see you. Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. I'm speaking to you from just outside Boston at my family's beach house. So I apologize if you see children flying by, or like paper planes, or I get hit by a ball, or any of those things, because you know what it's like with families and kids. And it's the summer here in Boston, so everybody is on the beach, and it's really hot. Probably not as hot as you guys, but it is really quite hot today. So for an Englishman who normally likes grey wet, I'm a little bit hot. So I apologise if I'm sweating as well. But it's great to see you, and it's great to be invited. Thanks, Joel, for setting this up. Now, I'll go into the slides in a moment, but I want to set some context for the slides. This is a presentation that Ken and myself delivered in Scrum Day London. And then, funny story about that, I was delivering online with him. I was presenting in flesh, he was in Boston, and he changed the slides just before the presentation was delivered. So that some of my slides weren't the slides that we'd agreed to. So working with Ken Schwaber, the creator of Scrum, is a bit like bullfighting. It's entertaining for everybody, but can be a little bit scary. So I'm going to stop presenting my webcam now, so that you can see the slides, because I've only got one screen today. So let me, and I suggest you do the same. But at the end, when we do questions, I'd love to see you again. So I will stop sharing now and go and share my screen instead, okay?
Okay.
Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen. Let me just minimize this, minimize that. Can you see the screen, guys? Can you see the screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. Let's get going. So this year is a very special year for Scrum. It turns 21 in October. And in America, 21 is a very big milestone. So this presentation is intended to celebrate Scrum, the last 21 years, talk a little bit about its evolution, and then talk about where it's going to go, what's next for Scrum. and hopefully you'll get an appreciation for the exciting things that are happening with Scrum today, and hopefully an idea of some of the things that we as a community, so not just Scrum.org and me, but you guys as well, are going to help us do. So this is a good presentation for that. Now, as you notice, I'm English, but I live in America, so my family think I speak very strangely, even though I think I speak perfectly well. But I also know that you guys, as fabulous as English is for you, and you're all amazing at speaking English, that it's not your first language. So I'll try to speak slowly, I'll try to speak, you know, using words that hopefully are understandable, but feel free to stop me, and our Scrum Master, Joel, can make sure that it happens. You can stop me if you are too embarrassed or I can't hear you. Feel free to say, hey, I missed that. So feel free to stop me and slow me down, because English people speak very, very quickly. So I apologize if I... So I'm Dave West. I'm the product owner and CEO of Scrum.org. I'll tell you a little bit more about Scrum.org in a minute, but imagine I'm the product owner for Scrum, and my main stakeholder is Ken Schwaber. And you can imagine what life that's like. The guy that invented it, I now own the product that he invented. So it's an interesting job, very exciting job. And I'm, as I say, speaking to you from America, from Boston, just outside Boston, in a place called Cape Cod, which is sandy beaches and little shacks, and it's cute. Anyway, so what am I going to be talking about today? I'm going to be, there's a picture of me in case you missed me. I'm going to be talking to you, I'm going to be telling a story about where Scrum is, how successful it's been, and then I'm going to talk about some recent innovations that probably Joel will be talking about during the day. Things like Nexus, things like EBM, the Scrum values, what's been happening with the Scrum values, and some other things around that. And then I'm going to talk about upcoming innovations, what's next. And we still have some challenges to solve. And there's my contact details. Feel free, if you don't get the opportunity to ask the question today, and send me an email or tweet me, direct message me on Twitter, and I'll hopefully be able to answer them, or find somebody that can. Okay, to set the scene, we have to go back. We have to go back 30 years. Now, I looked at some of you in the room. You weren't born 30 years ago, or you were still in kindergarten. But 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, Jeff and Ken realized that building software wasn't working the way they were trying to make it work. Ken was very focused on computer-assisted software engineering, CASE, and the process for building software. And he realized that he was continually having failures in his software development projects, as was Jeff. Now, interestingly, Jeff and Ken met at a church group, strangely. They started talking about this stuff. They shared a lot of values, and they started doing some research. Now, there was lots of different research that led to Scrum, but perhaps the most pivotal piece of stuff that really drove Scrum was this piece from Harvard Business Review, HBR, called the New Product Development Game. This was research by Harvard Business School on why innovative companies are successful. What do they look like? And in this piece, they describe a process very similar to Scrum, which is very, very exciting. That led to experimentation by Jeff and Ken and others in the community, which led to them being invited to the Agile Software Development Meet in Snowbird, where they created the Agile Manifesto, which led to Ken creating the Agile Alliance in 2001 to answer all the emails that he was being sent about the manifesto. The Agile Alliance wasn't really equipped for innovation. It was really just a community. So out of that, he built Scrum Alliance in 2004. Scrum Alliance decided to go in a different direction to the one that Ken wanted. Ken's very passionate about software development. He's very passionate about assessment and having a very good testing process. And he's also very passionate about the quality of the people that are spreading the message. And those three things Scrum Alliance didn't share, so Ken formed in 2009 Scrum.org, which is what I run for him today in 2016. And Scrum.org's mission is a very simple one. It's not about Scrum, it's about the profession of software development. This actual slide may change by the end of this presentation, but we'll come back to that. Ultimately, we care about you guys, you people out there, delivering software better, in wowing your customers and being professional in its execution. We like to think of ourselves as the home of Scrum. Now this data's a little out of date. I'm sorry, I meant to update the slide, but I got sidetracked yesterday afternoon. I apologize. So when the PDF version of this deck is sent to you, it'll have a different slide. This is actually 2 months old, but I want to draw a couple of things out. One, we've got actually 163 professional Scrum trainers, of which Joel is one of them. 55,000 classes taught, we're all over the world. What's interesting about this is the professionalism aspect. Over 1 million people, we've touched over 1 million people doing assessments. Now, that's an incredible number. Every day, about 5,000 people take assessments around the world. They don't all pass them, that's a different number, but they all take them. And you'll see PSM, which is probably the most important assessment around Scrum in the industry today, is taken by about 67,000, because this data is a little old. And here's some other data. The point I'd like to raise though, at Scrum.org, we care about the profession, and we care about people proving and having that standard knowledge and proving they have that standard knowledge. And we do that with professional Scrum trainers, assessments, and community, of which this is an example of community. So, Scrum.org, the home of Scrum. Let's now talk a bit about Scrum. What's been happening with Scrum? Now, hopefully, all of you guys in the room know a little bit about Scrum. That's why you're at this meetup. But what we've found from some data, over 90% of agile teams use some form of Scrum. Now, whether that's professional Scrum is a different matter, but ultimately, 90% of agile teams, and agile accounts for well over half of all software delivery projects today. Over 100 books with Scrum in the title. Now, these are just English books. I didn't research it anymore, but over 100 books in Scrum in the title. And when my intern started looking at the broader thing, we stopped over 500 that had Scrum in it somewhere. Over 500,000 people trained, and the Scrum Guide, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later, is free and available to everybody. Scrum is free. Scrum is a lightweight, simple framework that's available to everybody to use throughout the world. Now, ultimately, this gives it an incredible power. There's a defined definition of what Scrum is. There's no interpretation. The Scrum Guide, we manage the site, but Jeff and Ken have taken what Scrum is and put it in the Scrum Guide, and it's freely available to everybody. It's been translated in 46 or 43 languages, including some languages that I didn't even know existed, which is always amusing. And it's available for everybody to use. And it forms the basis of the majority of agile approaches around the world. So we should celebrate. Millions of people every day are doing a daily Scrum. Millions of people every day are in Scrum teams with a Scrum Master and a product owner. Every 30 days at least, everybody's doing a sprint review. That's really, really cool. The term retrospective is mainstream now. These are all great things. So obviously in America we like to have fireworks blasting after to celebrate. And really this is for you guys to celebrate, because without you, Scrum would not have been successful. Now here's the big but. Unfortunately though, Scrum has been incredibly successful, but it hasn't been necessarily had the impact on the industry that we would have liked. This is something called the Standish Chaos Report. It's by a gentleman who we know very well called Jim Johnson. He's a very good, close personal friend of Ken. What you see is that really failure, success and challenge projects, which is a very clear definition if you go to the report, hasn't really changed. Yeah, they've bubbled around a little bit, some years are better than other years, but ultimately they're that same sort of order of magnitude. And even though the data that we found was that agile projects are actually more likely to be successful, even in the case of large projects, ultimately the industry is still not delivering to the promise that we need. And we need it to deliver, because I don't know about what you guys in Peru, but ultimately we in America, software is the commodity of innovation today. Whether it's Uber, Airbnb, whether it's Facebook, Netflix, all of this technology, whether it's a new cancer drug, whether it's a heart pacemaker, ultimately it's enabled by software, which is very, very exciting. When we look at why Agile isn't perhaps as successful as we look at projects, and we look at why Agile sometimes fails, we see this data from, this is from the version 1 survey, a very good survey actually, by a vendor. What we see is that actually the biggest hurdle to success seems to be the culture of organizations. Organizations are optimized around a waterfall life cycle, which is optimized around really control and efficiency. Now, Scrum may not be the most efficient process in the world. We don't care, because it's scientific, it's empirical, and that allows us to get visibility on problems that we've never solved before. Now, it's very hard to build a very efficient process when you don't know what the problem is you're trying to apply that process to. So ultimately, we see in most organizations a serious clash between Scrum and the rest of the organization. We see this thing called water, scrum, full. This was a term that I coined when I was working at Forrester Research to describe the phenomenon of Scrum at the team level being very successful in a context of a waterfall planning and release world. Now, the reality in most organizations is water, scrum, full, which isn't necessarily really, really bad. You get a lot of the benefits of at least teams working to build software, but you don't get the business agility that most organizations are seeking. And there's many reasons why organizations haven't managed to grow Agile out of that team level. And these are some of the issues, some of the approaches organizations are trying. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, other than just to briefly talk about these 3 ones. We could spend an entire day talking about these 3 models of enterprise change. The first one is the model that Ken and Jeff originally believed would work. They believed that if Scrum was super successful at the team level, at the practice and practitioner level, that everybody else would start adopting it. And all of the impediments that come out of the retrospectives would be fed back into the organization, and then they would fix the organization from the team out. Very exciting. However, we've seen with Water Scrum Full that isn't the case. Other people have taken a slightly different approach. Yes, Scrum might be still at the team level, but what they've done is they've tried to commingle it using approaches like SAFe and DAD to try to commingle Agile with a less than Agile model, where it's still relatively waterfall. You may use different terminology, you may potentially use some great ideas from the Agile community, maybe stuff from Lean in particular, but ultimately it's still a sequential flow, even if you do some great stuff around planning and then use a release train to deal with the complexity of overlapping applications and products and teams.
Dave,
Now.
Dave.
Oh, hi.
Hi, could we stop here a minute just to ask our people if they have some questions? Please, let me a minute. ¿Tienen alguna pregunta, algo que quisieran recalcar? Acerca de los 21 años de Scrum, la historia.
I assume you're speaking Spanish because I couldn't understand.
Yeah.
But I might be wrong.
I'm trying to understand. Here, I'm speaking Spanish. ¿Tienen alguna pregunta? En este momento estaba hablando acerca de los fracasos de los proyectos en cascada, de los motivos por los cuales fracasan los proyectos ágiles. Es decir, hoy en día muchas empresas dicen: yo uso Scrum, yo hago Daily Scrum, yo hago Retrospective, ¿no? Yo uso Scrum, yo ya me leí la guía, no llevé el entrenamiento y yo ya sé, ya leí la guía. Pero ustedes han visto que el principal motivo que señala Dave es la cultura. Las personas no están acostumbradas a trabajar en función de producto ni trabajo en equipo, ¿no? Y está hablando de algo muy importante que suena mucho en las empresas grandes, que se llama SAFE. Voy a mencionar SAFE hace un momento. SAFE es un marco de referencia que supuestamente que escala. Ustedes abren el paquete y ya son ágiles. Ustedes compran una caja y abren el paquete, ya son ágiles. Y bueno, Dave está hablando de algo que se llama Waterfall. Es enfoque cascada, enfoque tradicional, ¿no? Water Scrum Fall. Es un Scrum camuflado acerca de, o sea, en lugar de tener un proyecto de análisis 2 meses, diseño 2 meses, ¿no? Desarrollo, ahora lo he reducido a un sprint de 1 mes, y entonces las 2 primeras semanas hago análisis, la tercera semana vamos de diseño y la tercera semana hago, ¿no? O sea, es un Water Scrum Fall. De eso está hablando ahora.
Yo una consulta. Sí, ¿qué tipo de proyectos son los que más, digamos, podrían aplicar el tema de Scrum? Proyectos largos, proyectos cortos, muy complejos.
Vamos a abordar esa pregunta para luego al final, ¿ya? Acerca, porque luego de que Dave termine hay esperamos una serie de preguntas. La pregunta de Martín es una de las que siempre nos preguntamos, ¿no? Lo puedo usar en un banco, lo puedo usar en una corporación, lo puedo usar en mi empresa, lo puedo usar con 5 desarrolladores, 20 desarrolladores. Y la respuesta, bueno, Dave ha venido dando algunas cosas, como por ejemplo ha hablado de Nexus. Nexus es un marco de trabajo de Scrum para múltiples proyectos, equipos de trabajo de Scrum, probablemente 200, 400, 500 personas, ¿no? Habló de Nexus, habló de EBM, Evidence Based Management, gestión basada en evidencia. Evidence Management está dirigido a los administradores, empresas, a los gerentes, ¿no? Para que inicien esa transformación, para que se basen en evidencia de productos, no evidencia de informes de avance, evidencia de productos, ¿no? Habló de Evidence Based Management, habló también de los valores que se han incluido en la guía de Scrum hace 2 semanas. Una semana yo publiqué en mi LinkedIn, la guía de Scrum ha cambiado, se han agregado los values que antes no estaba, ¿no? Bueno, yo les estoy anotando un poco lo que está hablando. Si tienen alguna pregunta, la anotan. Si hay alguna pregunta acerca de lo que está hablando, lo vemos ahora. Y si tienen una pregunta muy particular, como por ejemplo, yo tengo un proyecto, ¿cómo uso? ¿Qué hago? Se lo preguntamos luego. La pregunta de Martín queda para eso. ¿Seguimos? Sí. Dave.
Hey.
Everything is okay. We can go on.
We can carry on.
Thank you.
I love it. It's like, you know, there's suddenly everything stops. There's lots of Spanish being shouted, and then you're like, oh, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's like going to a Spanish restaurant. It's great. So I will carry on. So the top 2, the idea of subsuming, Scrum basically growing organically throughout the organization. The second one is basically incremental mingling of cultures and managing the interfaces using approaches like SAFE and DAD and the like, which is good. I'm not saying it's bad. And then the other one is really a traditional cutter type organizational change model, where you try to change the whole culture, but you do it very slowly in a very planned way. Now, interestingly, John Cotter has recently said this approach to change is very ineffective. And even though he built a career on it, made lots of money on it, he actually hasn't managed to make it that successful. And that doesn't mean that some of these approaches don't work. It means they're incredibly hard to scale. So enterprise agility is disappointing. The next point is really interesting, and this is something that Ken has a personal sort of hatred of. The fact that different scrums are being taught even in the same organization. Recently, we were at a large financial institution that I have a personal relationship with the CIO, and he said to me, I'm disappointed because Scrum isn't consistent in my company. And I said, really? So he ran some surveys to see. People have different views what a backlog is, the role of the product owner, even what the Scrum Master is. You know, that all of the ideas of Scrum are being perverted, isn't the right word, because some good reasons to do it, but they're inconsistent. And the Scrum Guide, the body of knowledge, we asked over 100 people in this company, and only about 20 of them even knew of the Scrum Guide's existence. So ultimately, this perversion, this snake oil, as Ken would call it, I wouldn't quite as nasty as that, has ended up with every consultant having their own Scrum. Now, Scrum.org is very focused on what Scrum is as defined by the Scrum Guide. And the assessments insist on that consistency. PSTs, professional Scrum trainers, have to deliver a consistent message around what Scrum is. Now that's just our approach to it. Now inside your own organization you may try to do something different, but ultimately as long as you're consistent, and hopefully that's ratified by the Scrum Guide, then that's good. However, we need as an industry to stop changing words for the sake of changing words, and it's either Scrum or it's not. If it's not, it still might be good, but it's not Scrum. And that's very important. The other thing that we're seeing in the industry is some very high-profile failures. For examples in Europe and the US of programs and projects that ultimately highlighted the lack of honesty and integrity in our software delivery culture. Ultimately, healthcare.gov or Obamacare, as it's also known, was delivered massively late and then didn't work. That first, when it went online, it fell over because the performance wasn't adequate. Volkswagen cheated the admissions tests, all actually enabled by software. So professionalism is increasingly important in our industry. If we don't do this, somebody else is going to do it to us. And then, if the government tends to get involved in these things, we all know what the impact that's going to be. So as a community, with Scrum at the heart of it, with empirical process at the heart of it, we need to step up our game around professionalism. Okay, hopefully I set the scene there for you guys. We know that Scrum is incredibly successful. It's in the majority of agile implementations. It's being used by millions of people every day. Well, maybe not today because it's a Saturday, but probably only hundreds of thousands today. We know that it's been incredibly successful, but we also know that our industry still isn't building software greatly. We also know that we've got some challenges around inconsistent implementations. We've got some challenges around agile growing across the enterprise to allow us to be more agile and innovative as businesses. And that Scrum, though practiced at the team level, isn't driving out into the organization, which not only makes it harder for those Scrum teams, but it also makes the values of business agility not come through. And we know that professionalism is a real problem in our industry. So let's talk a little bit about what the Scrum community is doing to fix some of those things. And I'm going to talk now about things that are available today that you can work with Joel on, you can work with Scrum.org on, you can work with the industry on. And then there's going to be a section on stuff that isn't really quite available, though we're doing some interesting things. One of the first things that we can talk about is this concept of measurement. How today do we understand what's valuable from what's wasteful? Before Scrum.org, I managed an engineering organization of 50 people. We were a startup, we got funding, we grew, it was very exciting. And one thing that we were always wrestling with, was how do we measure success? It's very important to translate real measurement for the team so that they can know that their sprint goal and the work that they're doing ultimately results in some change that's valuable to the organization. Now that might be a learning change, we realize it didn't help, which is also valuable, or it might be a positive change, which is also positively valuable. And we like to think that direct evidence is the only way to talk about this. Yes, things like velocity, technical debt, defect density, all of those things, psychometric complexity, mean time to resolution, all those things are interesting, but ultimately they're not valuable unless they can be directly tied to real business value. So let's talk a little bit about something called EBM, evidence-based measurement. EBM has 3 axes. It has a current value point of view, and these are the things that you would look for in your organization to determine current value. Revenue, product cost, employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction. These are some examples. There's more data on this if you want, we can point you at some stuff. But ultimately, some level of current value, some level of innovation ability. So the ability to deliver new stuff, the ability to deliver new stuff that's actually used, the ability to deliver change, the stuff that customers are using, quality. And then the third dimension is around time to market. How fast can we get stuff out from idea to implementation, or concept to computer, as it's also known, or how frequent can we do that, how stable is it, and what is our overall cycle time? We take these 3 areas of data, bring them together, we can create something called an agility index. This agility index is a ratio that allows us to see what we have today, but also measure how it changes over time. It's a really interesting idea that Ken developed a number of years ago and is used in a number of organizations. If you want to find out about it, Google EBM or talk to anybody at Scrum.org. Okay, so EBM is one recent innovation that's kind of interesting. Now, the next innovation talks a little bit about scale. So today, most Scrum teams are successful in spite of the world that they live in. Around the back, they're surrounded by complex applications, complex processes, complex data models, it's a spider's web of dependencies with overlapping complexity. And they're successful because of it. They have a backlog, they work to that backlog, and they survive. And Scrum, the framework, lends itself very nicely to that. You can see here a nice picture of the Scrum framework. Nice, simple, lightweight, works for a single team. But what happens when you've got multiple teams working on the same endeavor? We'd like to think of the same product. How do you get them to work well together? So this was a challenge. Scaling product delivery was a real challenge. So about 3 years ago, Ken realized that people just didn't get it. He'd written about it, Jeff had written about it, lots of people had written about it, but ultimately people were inconsistent in its approach. Scrum of Scrums, they were talking about how refinement worked, that they were stabilizing sprints, which is an evil idea. You know, all of these things, incomplete definitions of done, incremental definitions of, anyway. a phase approach to done, which sounds waterfall to me. There was lots of chaos around this. And there was a lot of talk around how do you scale and how do you scale product delivery. So, Ken did a lot of research. He talked to the professional Scrum trainers community, the PST community. He went to a lot of organizations. And from that, working with others, he gathered an approach to dealing with scale, which is called the Nexus. Now, the Nexus is an exoskeleton to Scrum. When we say exoskeleton, we mean extension to Scrum that adds a series of additional activities or roles. This is interesting. This isn't a complete picture of the Nexus, which is, I've just realized, but we'll come back to that in a moment. This is just a bit of the Nexus. But it basically provides additional roles. Nexus integration team is the primary one, Additional events or ceremonies, and additional artifacts to the normal Scrum. But really it's just Scrum with some extra things on top. As you can see here, it looked remarkably like Scrum. So a couple of interesting points that came out of Nexus and our research was, one, when teams and teams of teams grew to more than 100, Nexus stopped working. And about 100. You know, it could be 120, it could be even 150. But ultimately, what we saw was that scale was a problem. And that there was a finite model in these very complex systems that most of us were building. There's a finite size that actually is practical. And the reason is because dependencies. Now, Nexus is all about solving the dependency problem. And it provides you with Scale Professional Scrum, it provides you with a series of practices and a framework for actually doing that. Now, what we've identified, though, is at a certain point, those practices and that framework cease to be valuable. They stop working, or the overhead of running them is too big for the actual ability to deliver software. And what we've identified is then you need to do what we call Nexus Plus. You know, you have to basically start taking advantage of architectural patterns, like decoupling, high cohesion, decoupling things, using interfaces, using product lines, using, you know, all sorts of other things become relevant. But Nexus, there's a guide available, there's training available on it, Scale Professional Scrum, and we're starting to see it being used in a lot of large organizations. At the moment, I'm writing a case study with Cathay Pacific, the airline organization, who have multiple teams working together using the Nexus to facilitate that. So, what's interesting is, when we look at Nexus, we see it being valuable in all ways of scaling. So this was a survey from our friends at version 1. And you'll notice that Scrum is in all scaling approaches. Scaled Agile Framework uses it, Scrum of Scrums is incredibly popular, DAD uses it, Less obviously is Scrum. It's funny that, so all of those scaling approaches rely on you being able to scale product delivery and provide very little guidance on how to do it. So that means that if you use Nexus, you can take advantage of Nexus if you're doing Scrum. And it's not a Nexus or Safe or DAD or Less, it's Nexus and, which is really quite interesting. And we're seeing that. Now, I do question whether Safe or DAD or etc. helps you scale agility, but that's a different question. With respect to scaling product delivery in an agile way, Nexus provides a great exoskeleton to Scrum, assuming you're using Scrum, to scale. Okay, so 2 innovations, EBM, evidence-based measurement, and the Nexus, a practical exoskeleton or framework to scale Scrum and scale product delivery in organization. The next thing I just want to briefly talk about is the Scrum Guide. You'll notice 2 weeks ago, maybe you saw the webinar, it's available, there's movie on YouTube. Go to www.scrum.org and look for it. Go to resources there, it's available. The Scrum Guide was refreshed recently. Now the Scrum Guide is a very lightweight definition of Scrum. It is the definition of Scrum. It doesn't tell you everything you need to know about delivering working software every 30 days, but it does tell you what the framework is. And so it's authored by Ken and Jeff. Now, and maintained by scrum.org. Now, what's interesting is it doesn't change very often. And that's good, because it shows the value of Scrum. Over the last 21 years, there's been some changes, but they've been relatively minor. This change, though, 2 weeks ago, was a very exciting change. And the reason why it's exciting is because we brought back the values. Now, the values are basically how you execute Scrum from a social point of view. So you can think of them as how a society, by its very nature, has to have values. In America, those values are very clearly documented in something called the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. In the UK, they're less well documented. It's something, you know, the Magna Carta, maybe. I don't know. And I don't know what they are in your country, but ultimately these values like commitment, focus, openness, respect and courage are things that every Scrum team should think about. They should commit to delivering working software and to commit to the practice, the process that they're following. They should focus on what's most important rather than all of the work they're told to focus on. They need to be open for frequent inspection, even if that means that you have to admit you don't know something. And because of that, you need to respect people and allow self-organization and cross-functioning to effectively work. And you need to have courage, because there's lots of times in Scrum where you have to say, I just don't know. But this is what I'm going to do, so I do know. And that's the idea of, obviously, a sprint. Courage, focus, commitment, respect, and openness. They're in the Scrum Guide now. Go to your Scrum Guide. The Spanish translation might be done. It tends to be very popular. I'd say it's probably the second most popular Scrum Guide, that translation. So feel free to have a look at it. Comments are always welcome. Always good to expand our thinking. I wrote a blog on it. Gunther wrote another blog. This body of knowledge hopefully will start helping you as Scrum practitioners to get that social system in your organization, which ultimately can help change the culture from a command and control, fear-oriented culture to one that's more open to innovation, open to learning, and open to delivering in a very different way. So, EBM. Think about measuring in a different way. Nexus, think about adding some framework on top of Scrum to scale multiple teams when they're working on the same product or same endeavor. And then the values. The 5 values are now part of the Scrum Guide. Think about how you can apply them every day. The blog I wrote has some advice on ideas that I've seen people use to bring values into their organization. Okay, so there's some recent stuff. So Scrum hasn't just stopped. There seems to be lots of really interesting things happening around Scrum. But what's next around Scrum? What are the things that Ken and Jeff and others in the community are thinking about? What's things that people like Joel are arguing about on the PST lists? And that I say that with a smile, because 163 incredibly smart people, you can imagine how many different ideas are in that audience. So I'll talk a little bit about a few things. First, I'm going to talk about done. Done isn't perhaps as successful as we would like it to be. Today, a lot of organizations are managing to do test requirements and test maybe even some good forms of testing, as in system, as in unit, as in integration testing, in their increment and in their sprint. So their definition of done for a product backlog item includes a lot of things around development, maybe all the things around development. But still, a lot of organizations are challenged with the next boundary, which has been encapsulated in a movement called DevOps. So they're doing Scrum, so they're delivering working software, but it's not going into production. Oh dear. And the DevOps movement's driving that. And some, very few organizations, have already got DevOps, so every increment that they release, that they create, is actually released into production, and maybe they're using feature toggles to control the potential shippable idea, but ultimately they've got a very sophisticated process, and they're pushing towards adding EBM, adding that value-based measurement, might be called lean analytics, into the process. So they're looking at instrumentation to allow you to know where you're done. Let me put a misnomer to bed now. A lot of people misunderstand what a sprint review is. A sprint review is not a phase gate to release into production. A sprint review should be an opportunity to inspect and adapt at the sprint boundary. And retro allows you to do that. Ideally, you're inspecting and adapting software that's in production. Ideally, the data you're using for the sprint review is actually people using the software. Ideally, your ability to inspect and adapt is based on real customer usage. How cool would that be? That's the future. Now, the reality is most organizations can't do that at scale. We had an idea, well, Ken had an idea and looked at this and said, well, maybe we need to help them more. Maybe Scrum is missing an artifact, or maybe a set of practices to actually help organizations consistently deliver to done. And he coined the term software Scrum development kit, which is a pun, which is a play on words with the idea of software development kit. So many years ago when I built software still, the days when I was probably a lot happier. No, that's not true, not totally true. But building software, I used to use, I was a C++ developer, and then I was a Java developer after that. And I used to use software, these SDKs, to help start the work I was doing. Now what's interesting is that actually those software development kits included code, yes, sometimes tests, yes, documentation, yes, and sometimes even build scripts, or at least documentation of how to build a build script. Now think about that if you extend it. Think about that if it included development environments. Think about that if it had practices done to ops. Imagine if it had infrastructure tools, APIs necessary to interface, so the classic SDK kind of stuff, development standards, apps and module calls necessary to support it, and then the infrastructure to make it work. If we could build something like this in an organization to provide a baseline, it doesn't have to be completely comprehensive, but a baseline to allow organizations to effectively scale done in a consistent way. This would help organizations do it. The idea of an SDK. Now, last 3-4 weeks ago, we ran our first SDK kind of workshop with a guy called Gary Pedretti. And we've built out a set of ideas about how you can build an SDK and what it would look like in your organization. And we can talk at length about that. But ultimately, we need something like this to help us scale in organizations to consistently get to that real level of done. And we need to have an artifact that drives it. And we think that an SDK is that artifact. Okay. So, We talked a lot about current innovations. Now we're starting on the future innovations, and the first one is this idea of an SDK. I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the only way for Enterprise Agile is to really go back and look at why innovation succeeds in organizations. And look at that new product game. And look at the ideas of Lean Startup. And look at the concepts that Stephen Blank talks about in respect to innovation and entrepreneurialism. And look at those ideas and build a whole different organization. We believe that the only way to scale Agile is not to try to change your existing organization. Instead, it's to build a different one. Dare I call it a very agile organization? Dare I call it an organic kind of organization? Dare I call it a very flat organization? So we believe that the only way to scale agility, that doesn't mean you can't get value out of it, how it's currently being used. It doesn't mean it's not good in your current organization. However, the only way to truly give business agility is this idea of Scrum Studio. Scrum Studio takes the traditional software development organization, which is very hierarchical, which is built around efficiency, which is functional silo, specialization of labor, where the planning uses PMOs to basically drive down, in a very efficient way, work to resource it and manage risk in that way, to an agile organization, which is network, product-oriented, service-oriented, value-based, can deliver increments to production continuously, adopts all those modern practices, and uses Scrum and Nexus at its heart. And we believe that Studio will provide an environment that uses EBM, that allows consistent use of Scrum, that has an SDK to help deliver done, that uses Scrum and Nexus as a way of delivering amazing software, and that uses an SDK to scale that delivery of done working software. Let's talk briefly about some of the characteristics of a Studio. One, it conforms to the Agile Manifesto and the culture of agility, which is about empirical approaches, really. This idea of basically building an innovation center. Its products is the currency that it delivers and works on. It is not just software development, but also delivery. So that means that we don't need ops, we don't need DevOps, we need no ops. We need it integrated into the teams and into the NITs to effectively deliver working software. It has all the stuff that the Scrum team needs to deliver software. Its products are onboarded into this organization. That means that they go through a certain set of stages. Maybe there's a certain maturity model that a product needs before it can come into this organization to be run on. For instance, it needs clear product ownership. It needs to have a P&L. It needs to be value, or it needs to have a clear definition of what its boundary is. Some of those things are very important. It's measured by EBM and value-based measurement. The teams persist, and the tribal, this sort of Spotify type model. We use an SDK. Ken likes to call it a methodology. I wouldn't go that far. We use modern, proven software practices and tools. And it's professional. We have a high degree of integrity. We take the values of the Agile Manifesto and the Scrum values, and we use those as a basis to ensure that we have all those characteristics that we know that you need when delivering great software and building trust with your customers. That ultimately means, ladies and gentlemen, that we are going to change the focus of Scrum.org. So it's not just about development, because a studio includes delivery, and we become the organization that's trying to improve software delivery, the whole thing, the whole 9 yards. So today I've taken you through a little bit about Scrum, Scrum.org and Scrum, its evolution, its success. We talked about some of the challenges, things like what does Scrum for? We talked about some of the challenges, the inconsistency, some of the challenges, done being a great example. We then moved into recent innovations, EBM and Nexus. We then talked about the changes to the Scrum Guide, where values have become part of it. Then we moved on to future innovations, and we talked about two main things, Studio and SDK. The idea of SDK providing a consistent extension to a software development kit that's unique to Scrum and fulfills the needs of Scrum by providing consistent definition of done, the environment necessary to build consistent software, etc. And then we talked about Studio, the idea that ultimately to change the culture of an existing organization is almost impossible, or certainly very challenging. And instead, let's cheat. Let's create a separate organization that's built for agility. And we call that Scrum Studio. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about. And I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Maybe not. I'm going to stop. Yeah? Oh, I'm going to stop. And I'm going to bring up my webcam. And, well, maybe I'm not. And hopefully open the floor up for some questions.
Okay, thank you, Dave. We're going to have some questions here. ¿Alguna pregunta que tengan? Dave, I was very